On March 23, 1972, during Operation Linebacker in the Vietnam War, Lieutenant Colonel ICL Gene Hambleton, age 53, was flying an EB-66 electronic warfare aircraft over Laos when his plane was struck by enemy anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft went down behind enemy lines. Hambleton was the only crew member to survive, but he wasn't just any pilot. He held top-secret knowledge, satellite intelligence, radar jamming systems, and nuclear protocols. His capture would have been a devastating blow to the United States. What followed became the most complex and costly rescue mission of the entire Vietnam War. For 12 grueling days, Hambleton survived in the Laotian jungle without food, clean water, or proper shelter, dodging enemy patrols, enduring illness and clinging to hope. American forces launched a massive, multi-branch rescue operation involving Navy SEALs, Air Force commandos, and South Vietnamese forces. To avoid alerting the enemy, they devised a secret system to guide him using golf course codes based on Hambleton's love for golf. He had to crawl for miles, exhausted and hallucinating, through enemy-infested territory, guided by instructions, like move from the tee at hole 1 to the green at hole 2. When he was finally rescued, he had lost 45 pounds and was on the edge of death. The sun was barely rising over the mist-drenched jungles of Laos on March 23, 1972, when Lieutenant Colonel ICL Gene Hambleton zipped up his flight suit for what should have been another high-stakes but routine mission. At 53, he was the oldest man flying combat in the theater, a veteran of World War II and Korea, and now serving in Vietnam with a mind sharper than ever. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a walking vault of classified knowledge, decades of secrets, woven into muscle memory and reflex. He flew not with bombs, but with waves of electronic noise meant to blind the enemy. That day, aboard an EB-66 destroyer, he was to jam North Vietnamese radar, helping pave the way for a fleet of B-52s to deliver their payload. But the sky was no longer theirs. As the EB-66 sliced through the smoky air above the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a sudden jolt shook the frame, an explosion from beneath. Anti-aircraft fire had torn through the fuselage. Smoke billowed in. Alarms screamed. The wings caught fire. Gene's training kicked in, but the math didn't lie. The aircraft was going down, fast. One by one, his crewmates bailed out, vanishing into clouds and uncertainty. But Gene hesitated. He wasn't supposed to fall into enemy hands, not with what he knew. Still, the fire didn't ask questions. Moments later, he pulled the handle, and his world disappeared into wind and chaos. The jungle below rose up like a green ocean of death. His parachute caught the air, and seconds later, Gene crashed through a canopy of branches, slamming into the ground with a grunt that knocked the breath from his lungs. He lay still. The forest was alive with sounds, birds scattering, insects buzzing, and somewhere not far, the sharp clatter of gunfire. He'd landed in enemy territory, deep in it, alone. His survival kit had been lost in the fall. No food, no water, just a pistol and a radio he couldn't risk turning on. Beneath his helmet, sweat poured into his eyes. The war wasn't above him anymore. It was all around him, in the soil, in the trees, in the silence that watched him breathe. And yet, in the crushing solitude, Gene Hambleton understood. His real mission had only just begun. The jungle didn't sleep, not for one moment. As twilight fell over the mountains of Laos, Gene Hambleton lay motionless beneath a layer of wet leaves, blending into the earth like a dying ghost. Every muscle in his body ached, and his mouth was a desert of thirst. But pain wasn't the worst enemy here, noise was. Every rustle could betray him. Every breath might echo too loud. In this war, silence was survival. Gene knew that the Viet Cong and Pathet Lao troops would already be sweeping the area. They had seen the parachutes. They had watched the EB-66 burn in the sky. And they would hunt him, not for ransom, but for the treasure of knowledge hidden behind his tired eyes. He crept through the underbrush like a wounded animal, moving only at dusk and dawn, dragging his battered legs over rocks and roots. Days blurred. Nights screamed with unseen things. His radio sat quietly in his hand, a lifeline and a curse. He longed to call out, to say, "I'm alive," to hear another human voice. But he couldn't risk it. The enemy was listening too. His mind played tricks on him. He saw figures in the trees that weren't there, heard voices that belonged to dead comrades, and smelled smoke that never came. Hunger clawed at his belly. Water became his religion. He once drank from a muddy puddle teeming with larvae just to stay upright. The man who had once flown above the clouds, commanding radar and radio waves like a conductor, was now crawling in the mud, praying not for rescue, but for another hour. Back at the U.S. base in Thailand, panic had set in. They knew what Gene carried inside his head: details of strategic air command protocols, jamming frequencies, nuclear contingency plans. If captured, it wouldn't just cost American lives. It could compromise the entire Pacific theater. The Pentagon had declared it a priority mission. They'd already lost aircraft during early rescue attempts. One Phase-C pilot had gone down trying to reach him. Another had barely made it out. Now the CIA, the Air Force, and Navy SEALs were being pulled into what would become the largest rescue operation of the Vietnam War. But none of it mattered if Gene died first. On the fourth night, as Gene lay huddled inside a gnarled tree trunk, he heard footsteps. Boots, slow, deliberate, close. He held his breath until his chest screamed. A flashlight beam danced across the nearby foliage. He could see the silhouettes now. 2 enemy soldiers, rifles raised, scanning. One stepped within arm's reach. Gene tightened his grip on the pistol, knowing that firing would be suicide. But then, a rustle behind them. A monkey? A miracle? Whatever it was, the soldiers turned and vanished into the dark. Gene didn't move for another 2 hours. He just lay there, heart pounding, eyes fixed on a sliver of moonlight like it was the only star left in his sky. By now, Gene Hambleton was no longer flying the mission. He was the mission. Gene Hambleton hadn't spoken in days. His voice had dried up like the muddy streams he crawled past. His skin blistered under the sun. And when it rained, the cold sank into his bones so deeply that he shivered until he lost consciousness. His mind was beginning to dissolve, memories bleeding into hallucinations. He once saw his wife standing in a clearing holding a cup of coffee and smiling. He reached for her, then fell face first into a pile of leaves and broken glass. Still, he kept going. He didn't know what he was heading toward. But he knew what waited behind: death, capture, silence. And somehow that was enough. The Americans had to do something different. Traditional rescue methods had failed. Aircraft were being shot down. Ground teams were getting ambushed. The jungle was a snare, and the enemy knew the terrain far better than the man they were trying to save. But one young intelligence officer, flipping through Hambleton's personnel file, noticed something odd: his obsession with golf. It was his language. His piece. It gave them an idea. They began crafting coded messages, golf course instructions, disguised as survival routes. Using secure frequencies, a recon aircraft flew overhead and read out a strange message. "You're at hole number 1. Parfour. Dogleg right. Stay on the fairway." To anyone listening in, it was gibberish. But to Gene, who had walked those imaginary courses in his mind 1,000 times, it was a map. With every cryptic radio transmission, the invisible course unfolded through rice paddies, across ravines, along ridgelines watched by snipers. Hole by hole, the route was laid before him. It wasn't just clever. It was poetic. A dying man, crawling through enemy territory, guided home by the memory of Sunday mornings and 18 holes of green. But it was also perilous. Every step brought him closer to both rescue and to being spotted. Twice he narrowly avoided patrols. Once he spent an entire day submerged in a muddy stream, breathing through a reed while Boots passed by inches above his head. Meanwhile, the cost of his rescue was rising. 2 more American aircraft had been shot down, and soldiers were beginning to whisper, "Is this one man worth it?" The general said yes. The Pentagon said yes. And still, Gene didn't know. All he knew was the next hole, the next fairway, the next swing toward salvation. On the 7th day, Gene stumbled into a field of elephant grass and collapsed. His legs no longer listened. His lips were torn and bleeding. His eyes were sunken and wild, but somewhere deep in his chest, something still burned. He pulled himself an inch forward, then another. Not because someone told him to, but because somewhere up above, he could still hear it, the calm voice over the radio, calling out the next hole, like a guardian angel who played 9 under par. He whispered to the trees, "One more hole, just one more," and the jungle listened. By day 9, Gene Hambleton was no longer crawling, he was dragging. His boots had long since disintegrated, and the soles of his feet were raw, shredded open by roots and rock. Every breath was a battle. Every hour stretched into eternity. His bones pressed through his skin. Jungle insects fed on his wounds. His thoughts flickered like a dying bulb, snippets of golf tournaments he once watched with his father. Those fleeting sparks were all that kept him from surrendering to the jungle. That, and the radio crackling once a day, giving him one more hole to play. But the Americans knew time was running out. Gene had now been behind enemy lines for over 10 days. Intelligence reports confirmed enemy patrols were closing in. North Vietnamese trackers had picked up his trail. They were only hours away. Every failed rescue so far had cost lives. The jungle had swallowed helicopters whole. Fighter jets had been torn from the sky. The Pentagon was on edge. Morale was cracking. Some commanders quietly began preparing for the possibility that Gene would not make it out alive. But not everyone was ready to quit. Enter Lieutenant Tommy Norris, a 28-year-old Navy SEAL, and Petty Officer Nguyen Van Kiet, a South Vietnamese commando. They didn't believe in giving speeches or writing reports. They believed in doing the job. Together, they volunteered for what many considered a suicide. Mission: infiltrate enemy territory by sampan, disguised as fishermen, locate Gene, and extract him on foot, all while surrounded by heavily armed enemy forces. The plan was insane. No air cover, no artillery support. Just 2 men paddling up a quiet river in the dead of night, praying the fog held. Dressed in civilian rags and speaking in whispered Vietnamese, they passed enemy checkpoints, their hearts thundering in their chests. When one soldier lit a cigarette near the riverbank, Kiet paused mid-paddle and didn't move for 5 full minutes. A single wrong word would mean death, but somehow they passed unseen. By the time they reached the extraction zone, Gene was barely conscious. He hadn't eaten in days. His mouth was too dry to speak. His face was sunken like a skull. He thought the men approaching were phantoms, ghosts of fallen airmen, come to take him home. But when he saw the SEAL trident and the quiet fire in their eyes, he knew he was still in the fight. Years later, an interviewer asked him, what was the hardest part? Gene looked off, quiet for a long moment. Then he said, crawling through the jungle? That was hell. But knowing men died trying to bring me home? That's what I carry every day. He died in 2004. Not in the jungle, not in a war zone, but in peace, surrounded by family, with a folded flag beside his bed. At his funeral, they read out the names of the men lost in the rescue. Not a dry eye remained, because some missions don't end with the extraction. Some missions last a lifetime.